Jobless claim rise sharply to highest level since 2021. Again, this is a Fox Business story. Let's see this here. The number of Americans filing for unemployment benefits last week reached the highest level since 2021, with initial claims surging to by 22,000 to 264. This figure is well above the pre-pandemic average of 218 claims and marks the sharpest level of jobless claims since October 2021. Continuing claims, which represent Americans continuously receiving unemployment benefits, rose slightly to 1.81 million, indicating a potential cooling off in the historically tight labor market. Economists anticipate further increases in unemployment as a result of rising interest rates, leading to potential reductions in consumer and business spending. The Fed's projections suggest that officials expect the unemployment rate to rise above 4.6% by the end of next year, up from a current 3.5%. This could result in over 1 million job losses by the end of this year. Tom, what are your thoughts on this story?
Well, this is exactly what the Fed wanted to cause, is with whether they're the direct cause of it or it's now we're going to a cycle because we had overhired in 20 and 21. But this is what the Fed wants to see, is rising unemployment, and jobless claims is where it starts. What's really interesting is right now the unemployment rate, according to government, is 3.4%. And so that's 5.7, almost 5.75 million people unemployed officially. But then we have this 1.9 million jobless claims in there. So when you look at this and say that the last week, the week's claims is 264,000. That's like 25% of the current jobless claims. So it looks like this is inflating. LinkedIn came out, yet another tech company just laid off a little under 1,000 people. And the list of tech layoffs, we had a couple sheets in here, it was just incredible. Morgan Stanley, 3,000, 3M, 6,000, to name a couple companies that were outside tech. The headlines have been tech layoffs, but it's all coming. And people have been asking, what does this mean? Does this mean the recession is here? Remember, that's what they're asking. Does this mean that he keeps interest rates flat in June when he gets along? And we found an interesting chart here really quick. Malik, do you have the blue bars?
Malik. Just to give some context to what Tom's talking about, when you said this is what the Fed wanted, I believe you're referencing the showdown almost between Jerome Powell and Senator Kennedy of Louisiana when they had a little thing going on. His character, what he's talking about.
That's
Here's
exactly
what the Fed is talking about.
You're saying you want
exactly.
the joblessness to go up. You want people to be upset and out of work.
Yeah. Once you can kind of get past the almost like Wile E. Coyote looking thing.
What do you think about this?
Well, first and foremost, he's talking about something called the Phillips curve. So back in the Phillips curve, they had this idea where there was an inverse relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. So if the unemployment rate was low, then inflation would be high. And if the unemployment rate got higher, then inflation should come back down. That was totally debunked in the 1970s, but for some reason that's still part of their playbook. Now, one thing I'd also point out about jobs, if you go back a couple weeks or last Friday, I think it was, the non-farm payroll came out with this blowout number, right? But then they also revised the prior 2 months down by like 150,000 jobs. And I also saw a chart on Twitter that was very interesting. This chart was how many consecutive months that the actual number exceeded expectations. And it went back, let's say, 20 years, right? And the most it got up to was about 4 or 5 months consecutively where the actual number exceeded expectations. Now we're on 13. 13. I mean, it literally goes off the charts. But what they do is they've been revising down every single month prior, you see. So when you think about it, it seems like what they're doing is they're coming out with a blowout number just to make the administration look good. And then the next month, they're just revising it because they know that no one will pay attention to that and they'll just sweep it under the rug. So if you look at the revisions as the actual number, then they jive a lot more with this story that you're reporting on than the actual headline non-farm payroll. So it's very suspicious, to say the least.
I love that you use the word suspicious because I completely agree with you. And I also saw the sounds like you're reading it the same way I was. About 2 months ago, they had gone in and revised the definition of seeking work, and it was actually 5.1 million were had quote given up, and so they pulled them out of the 166 million total workforce that they estimate. Right?
Yeah.
62% participation rate, about 166 million people in the workforce, and what they did, they pulled it out. But if you put the two together and you doubled it, the unemployment rate, instead of being at that point 4, would have still been closer to 7.75.
Yeah. And the birth death model.
Correct.
I don't know if you saw that, but I don't know if you guys want me to explain that. But there's an adjustment for the headline non-farm payroll. It's just birth death. So what they try to do, it's not human beings, it's businesses. So what they try to do is guess how many businesses were started and then how many businesses failed within that time frame. And then since that's, I don't know why they can't report, but for some reason those brand new businesses can't report, so they have to guess as to how many jobs were actually created based on how many LLCs came into existence. And what's odd is they just assume that every single LLC that's created has X amount of employees. And as an entrepreneur,
That's how they're guesstimating?
Yeah.
That's one of the ways they do that. And so I saw a lot of people that I follow on Twitter that I'm friends with that are very, very smart.
Yeah.
And they took out that adjustment for the birth death model. And then if you do that, then it was basically 0, and it was much, much lower, which will most likely next month get revised even lower than that headline number. So it's all this kind of financial engineering, so to speak, that's making the jobs numbers look as good as they can. And keep in mind, that's the only thing that the Fed and the central planners and the Janet Yellen types have to say, hey, look at how great the economy is. Because every single other metric that they have, that even the Fed said like a year ago, that this is how you tell if we're in a recession. I'm referring to something called a near-term forward spread. I can explain that if you'd like me to. But they used to say, well, this is what you have to look at. This is what you have to look at, until that inverted. And they're like, no, don't look at that anymore. Look at the
Nothing to
unemployment
see
rate.
here.
Yeah, look at
What
the
are we saying
unemployment
now?
rate. So this is all they've got left is the unemployment rate. And that's why they might be kind of using these types of financial
Pat,
shenanigans.
speaking of suspicious, remember we did this on the podcast 2 weeks ago, how Biden created 10 million new jobs, whatever the crazy number was. Rob, you probably have the link, but it turned out it was just people who basically were fired during COVID and then just got their jobs back. These aren't really created
just
jobs. So
people
it sounds like
getting jobs back.
you can inflate a lot of these numbers.
What do we expect? It follows the process. You first increase interest rates. We've had the fastest interest rate increases since anyone can remember. Naturally, that's going to bring down inflation because spending is the first thing that stops. And only after spending stops do people stop hiring people. And so the job numbers are coming down. They are manipulated.
Yeah, and they lag.
They lag. But I think more importantly, I think this is probably the more important thing. The Fed's mandate is based on a concept which was debunked. So the Fed's mandate is based on inflation and unemployment. That's what the Fed looks at. And if you've been looking at what Jerome Powell has been doing and saying, no matter what happens around it, no matter what we think about the banking collapse or whatever else, we're focused on inflation and we're focused on unemployment. And that's really where the focus area is. And I think that the mandate of the Fed for this kind of scenario is probably wrong. And I mean, I like this end the Fed, but I think the mandate needs to be redefined.
Yeah, and another thing that's interesting, we're on the topic of unemployment, is one of the presentations from this weekend, a good friend of mine, Jeff Snyder, who's probably the smartest guy I've ever met, he looks at those curves, like the near-term forward spread, which is basically the current 3-month Treasury yield minus the 3-year Treasury yield that the market expects in 18 months, based on a variety of factors.
The priced in.
The yield.
Right.
So you look at the current 3-month yield compared to what the market is predicting the 3-month yield will be in 18 months, and then you subtract that. And right now, there's like a 200 basis point inversion. So what the market is saying is that they're predicting in 18 months, or within that time frame, the 3-month Treasury yield will be 200 basis points lower than it is today. So then he said, you got to sit back and ask yourself, what does that mean? What if the 3-month Treasury yield goes down by that much? What would the economic environment have to look like? And where would the Fed have to have interest rates as a result of that economic environment? And some of the conclusions that he came to is he thought that unemployment would be at double digits by the end of this year.
Double digits unemployment.
Double digits, and he thought that based on that, and based on the yield curve, the normal yield curve, and the near-term forward spread, and the Eurodollar futures curve and whatnot, that the Fed would most likely be at 0% by the end of this year.
Hold on, George, what you're saying is pretty shocking. You're saying it's at 3.5% now by the end of the year.
It's not at 3. No, the Fed funds is right now.
Oh, I thought you were talking about unemployment rate.
Well, yeah, I am. I'm sorry. I'm talking about unemployment as well. So unemployment goes from 3.5% to double digits by the end of this year. And the recession that's producing that causes the Fed to take rates, Fed funds, down from, let's say, 5% all the way back down to 0%. And and then think about what type of economy. Think about the banking crisis. Think about the black swan event that we would have to have in order for the Fed to drop rates that quickly. And another thing that I would add, there's a big psychological component here, right? Because you guys, if you study history, you guys know that history remembers Paul Volcker very well. It does not remember Arthur Burns well, right? And he was the Fed chair that preceded Paul Volcker. Everyone thinks that he didn't have the balls, basically, to take interest rates high enough to break the back of inflation. And sure enough, Paul Volcker comes in, and he had the huevos to get in there and do what needed to be done, even though it was very unpopular. So if you're Jerome Powell, who do you want to be remembered as? Obviously, Paul Volcker. So from a psychological standpoint, that puts him in a place where if he's going to err on one side or the other, he's going to err on the side of taking rates too high. But you see, the market knows that. And even when you include that psychological component, they still are betting that he's going to take rates almost down to 0 or around that area by the end of this year.
Baby and Snyder?
No, the market. Because if you look at how the market is placing their bets, the bond market, as an example, that's what they're saying is going to come to fruition. And the bond market is the smart money. I mean, if you look at just the basic yield curve with the 2-year Treasury and the 10-year Treasury, you can take that all the way back to 1950s. And that has almost 100% accuracy. When that inverts, 99% of the time, you get a recession. Now, what's interesting is right now it's still inverted. So the 2-year Treasury yield is higher than the 10-year Treasury. But the stuff doesn't hit the fan when the curve is inverted. It hits the fan when the curve is no longer inverted. And what usually happens is you have a bad when the yield curve steepens, you have a bad steepener and a good steepener. The bad steepener is when the 2-year goes back down below the 10-year, and almost always that's a result of the Fed dropping rates as a result of some sort of crisis situation. So those people that think that if the Fed drops rates, the stock market's going to rip higher, that unfortunately they're on the wrong side of history. And they might get a rude awakening, to say the least.
The bond market is right more often than the Fed narrative is right. And if you're looking at what the
yield curve is almost always right.
Always right. And if you look at what the Fed narrative is now, we're going to continue raising until the data says otherwise. But I think Paul Tudor Jones was on CNBC today, and he said, I wish they would say something like what they really wanted to say. So I'm not a big believer in the black swan event, which you spoke about. But I do think that there is something else that threatens the job market and could cause mass unemployment. And I don't think it's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months, but I do think it's going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months. And that's AI. So I think no one is forecasting for the dramatic change that AI is going to have on people's jobs. Because right now it's just chatbots and we're seeing the beginning of it. But remember that AI technologically does that.
Yeah.
And I think that that's going to cause a lot of people to lose their jobs. And I don't think we've recreated the new jobs as quickly as we're going to lose the old jobs. And I think that's a big thing that we've got to look out for. As I say, I don't think it's 3 to 6 months from here, but I do think that 12 to 18 months from here, we've got a massive jobs problem, and we're going to have a lot of unemployed people.
Yep. So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here. And if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.